Welcome, dear listeners, to another fascinating episode of the London History Podcast, where we delve into the vibrant and diverse past of this great city. I am your host, Hazel Baker, a qualified London tour guide and founder of londonguidedwalks.co.uk. Whether you're a born and bred Londoner or a curious listener, join us on a journey through time as we explore the city together. Each episode is supported by show notes, transcripts, photos and further reading, all to be found on our website. If you enjoy what we do, then you'll love our guided walks and private tours that we offer throughout the year, all bookable online at londonguidedwalks.co.uk. Subscribe now to never miss an episode. And if you enjoy the show, please leave us a review and rating to help spread the word to other history lovers. Dr Gillian Williamson, thank you so much for joining us. Your Georgian Landlords and Ladies was such a success. So many comments on it that I had to get you back when I knew you had written about the Gentleman's Magazine. So it might be worth getting to know, for our listeners anyway, looking at understanding yourself and your expertise and also the relationship with the Gentleman's Magazine.
I came to the Gentleman's Magazine as a researcher because I chose it as the subject for a PhD as a mature student. And the reason I chose it was because I'd been conscious that when I'd be doing other research, local history or my MA research, I'd always turned for the 18th century. I think the Gentleman's Magazine, that will have something about whatever. It might have a death notice of somebody, it probably will tell you what the weather was on a particular month in the 18th century. So it was always there in the background. And I thought nobody had particularly ever stood back and thought, why is it there? Why are there so many copies? Why does it have all this information? What was it for? And what did the readers make of it? So that's really what I wanted to do when I started researching the magazine in itself, was think about why this was such an important publication in the 18th century, why it lasted so long, from 1731 to 1907, which is an extraordinarily long life for this sort of publication. Most of them sort of fizzled out when the founder, editor, owner kicked the bucket. The magazine would eventually fold in a very short order. But this lived through several sort of lives of editors and so on. And I thought that was an important thing to think about.
It gives us a different view, doesn't it? Because it's not just from one person then.
No, it's different people and it's over the long term. So you can see how it might slightly change but also stay the same. And you can see it absorbing new influences and ideas over that long term. So it gives you an idea of the two things historians like to talk about. Is there change or is there continuity? And it's a long enough run of a magazine that you can look at both those things.
Yeah. I think it'd be a good question to ask in terms of, for the audience and also the audience of the Gentleman's Magazine, is what is or was a gentleman back then compared to our gentlemanly notions today?
I think the idea of what a gentleman was changing, and that's something that the founder of the magazine was effectively capitalising on. So a gentleman had traditionally been somebody of lineage, of birth, who'd inherited that sort of rank in society. You would have been somebody who didn't have to go out to work in anything grubby for a living, but who primarily drew income, family income from an estate, from a farmed estate, which you would probably tenant out. So it was somebody with a degree of leisure. You might have to place, if you had a lot of sons, you might have to place one or two in a more gentlemanly profession, like a barrister or perhaps a clergyman, a senior clergyman. But it was fundamentally somebody who was born into that rank and probably stayed in that rank, and it was quite difficult to move into it. And in the 18th century, the exciting thing is that beginning of a change to what we would think of as a more modern society, where those lines, demarcation lines between different social classes begin to break down enough that people can move up in the world relatively straightforwardly, probably in one or two generations. So a gentleman becomes something that you can work towards becoming. So you're not excluded because of, say, your background in a humble background in trade or whatever, or by having to earn your living. And then these people gradually reshape it and say, actually, to be a gentleman is to be someone who behaves in a gentlemanly way, who is hardworking, sober and sensible, sort of the foundation, if you like, of this new British society, which is much more commercial and is beginning to develop an overseas empire, changing completely from being based on land and farming towards being based on trade. And I think the Gentleman's Magazine also captures this change very well and was aimed substantially at these sort of new gentlemen, I call them, these new gentlemen who are making their own way in the world, establishing themselves and saying, I'm important. I may be a grocer from Hull. I am a gentleman because I have made a good living, I've worked hard, I've behaved well in my community, and I'm respectable, and therefore I am a gentleman. So that's what it's doing. So ultimately, if you could say confidently, I'm a gentleman, you were a gentleman if no one challenged it. And having rows of the bound copies of the Gentleman's Magazine or bookcase is saying to them, well, it says Gentleman's Magazine in gilt lettering. I own it. I own gentlemanliness. So I think that's what it was doing in society.
Because even when you're reading certain contemporary literature, say Lizzie Bennet, for example,
Yes.
in Pride and Prejudice, and she says, he is a gentleman, I'm a gentleman's daughter.
Yes.
And she goes back, who are your family? Who are they? They're all from trades. You're nothing.
And that's interesting, because actually Jane Austen probably did read the Gentleman's Magazine. Her father, a sort of middling-class professional vicar and school teacher, very typical sort of reader, was probably in the household. And in Northanger Abbey, the names of a lot of the characters appear to be taken from obituaries in a particular run of the Gentleman's Magazine at about the time that she was known to be drafting that.
I didn't know that.
So I think that's quite an interesting little fact. Maybe she got it from somewhere else, but I think was probably something that was available to her to pick up and read in the household.
Oh, fantastic. So for listeners who might not know, it might be worth you please giving a brief overview of the Gentleman's Magazine, of what it was, what it contained, and who it was written for, and the benefits for them owning it.
It was founded, the first number came out in January 1731, and it came out monthly until 1907. And what it aimed to be, what the founder, Edward Cave, who was a printer by trade, so he wasn't a writer or a man of letters, he had printing presses in St John's Gate in Clark, and he already was publishing various things. And obviously the more stuff, once you've invested in the capital of a printing press, the more you can keep them busy and push it through, the more profitable it is and the more worthwhile that capital investment is. So I think that was one of the reasons he started this, was to keep his press busy. But another reason was because he saw a gap in the market. He was a middling sort man himself. He came from a trading background in the Midlands. He'd had rather a varied career till he settled upon printing. So he had a lot of experience of middling sort life and what that was like, that people were very busy, they didn't have a lot of time. And he said, I'm founding this magazine because it will save people a lot of time. There's so much stuff you've got to read these days, newspapers and journals and tracts and this and that, to be on top of all the information you need to be successful in this new world. What I'm going to do is bring it out monthly, be a sort of summary of it all. So you don't have to buy all these other things, just buy this once a month and you see all the news, tidbits, politics, whatever that you need to know. So it's a bit like the idea of the Reader's Digest, if you like, and it summarises for people in one simple place. So for sixpence, you got 48 pages, which had a front half, which was articles lifted from elsewhere, so literally a Reader's Digest, and a back half with things like news and tables of currencies, weather, ships that had come in, factual information, and so personal announcements, births, marriages and deaths, we would call them. So it was all, you go to just one place and buy it. And it was a huge success from the start. So he was clearly right about that. It was the first print run, sold out, had to be reprinted. And really it soared from that point. So he had recognised something, I think, in Georgian society from his own personal experience.
And you said it cost sixpence. So in terms of, or relative terms of cost, if you had to buy all those different magazines,
yes,
and then buying the sixpence for the Gentleman's Magazine, was it saving them money and also the time for having to read them all? Or
yeah, but a newspaper might cost a penny or so. So depending on how many you read, It wasn't, let's be honest, it wasn't cheap at sixpence, because we're looking at a curate or a fairly modest tradesman might earn £50 a year, say. So you look at it in that context. £100 a year would be quite comfortably off if you were middling sort. So it's not cheap, because you're spending sixpence a month, and then if you're going to keep it, you spend another sixpence, for which you get like a frontispiece and an index, and then you can go to a bookbinder who will rip off the paper covers and put them in a nice binding for you. You can keep it as a sort of almost like a directory or encyclopedia. So it's not cheap within the context of those sort of income levels that I was mentioning. But on the other hand, it is prestigious because you're called a gentleman. You know, you're acquiring that by acquiring the magazine. And it is only buying one item rather than perhaps lots. And you didn't have to buy it. You could read it for free in various locations. So if you went to an inn or a coffee house, this was the sort of thing that the owners would have available for customers to read, to encourage them to linger a little and spend a bit more money.
Yeah. And where did he sell them? Was it by subscription or in bookshops? How did he get the magazine out?
It was in bookshops. So it was sent through bookshops. He didn't, unfortunately for the historian, there's not a list of subscribers, which would be lovely because then you would know. But there were thousands and thousands of people who bought it every month. When I say thousands of people bought it every month, it could be up to 10,000 people a month, which may not sound a lot, but you should bear in mind that even a popular novel would probably have a print run of about 1,000, which is not very many. And so this is selling thousands month after month. So throughout the year it is a lot, and a lot of people read each copy. So it's got a really big reach. It was the top seller. Basically, it went very quickly from being a new publication to being the best-selling Georgian periodical right until the end of the century, when its position began to waver a little bit. So he sold it through bookshops. So they were sent out on the mail routes, and he had worked in the post office, so he knew all about this. It was sent out to some bookshops and general stores throughout the country, including Scotland and Northern Ireland, quite far-flung places. So it was very easily available, more or less wherever you were. It was shipped out to the colonies, to the Americas, to the Indies.
Wow.
But sadly for me, there was no subscription list. I can see who some of these readers were because they sent in correspondence and they might sign it, or at least they might say, give themselves some sort of nickname, pseudonym, like a country curate, or that described themselves or said where they were from. But that sadly is about one of the only ways we can tell who actually read it.
Interesting. Yeah, so sixpence for investing in the future of yourself and your family. Yes. Good investment, especially if you're going to then spend the same amount again, binding it and putting it on your shelf for future reference. And we do appreciate good stats when going back and going, oh, how much did that sell for X, Y, and Z for the shipping? I think that is really useful information. You didn't have Google back then. So if you had that information at your fingertips.
Yes, and so it was indexed.
Yes.
Quite well by 18th century standards.
Yeah.
And then he produced printed indexes for like more extensive background. So periodically through the Georgian period up to about 1820, there were published indexes made for the whole thing by a professional indexer. So it was relatively easy to use.
Yeah.
In its collected form.
Yeah, great. And then being a success from episode 1, but understanding, as you said, the mailing systems, using reputable bookshops, things that are already working and successful, that would have helped as well, rather than starting from scratch.
Yes, it slotted in quite nicely to an existing sort of framework of places you might visit or shop.
And how did the Gentleman's Magazine influence or shape the course of journalism and periodical literature then? Did they do anything particularly groundbreaking, or did they do things better in a certain way?
One of the first things it did was gave us in English the word magazine, meaning a miscellany periodical. It had never been used in that sense before, and now we just use it all the time. So that word had only meant a physical magazine, had meant a physical store place. Perhaps for arms or a warehouse of a merchant would be a magazine, but not a printed periodical. So it gave us that term for this sort of miscellany journalism that encompasses all sorts of items within its covers. It framed some things that became very regular features, like sort of births, marriages and deaths. And it also gave, for the first time, a very big opportunity for its readers also to be published authors, to be writers. And that, I think, is another thing that sets it apart and helps the rise of these sort of ambitious middling sort people, whereas most of it originally was excerpts from things that already existed, just shamelessly lifted poetry articles from other magazines and books. Within about 10 years, so by the 1740s, most of the magazine is being written by its readers, which is fabulous. You haven't got to have so much paid staff. You haven't got to be paying salaries to people. People are just sending in letters, puzzles, poems, and begging to be published. So it also gave these people an opportunity to become men and women of letters and to have a little attempt to insert themselves into the magazine. You see your name in print. So I think that was one of the key things it gave, this reader's contribution.
And we say this even now with our blogs and the user-generated content.
Yeah.
It's so valuable.
Yes.
And here they're doing it in Georgian society exactly the same.
Yes, and of course it gives people a sense of ownership of the magazine. It's their magazine. It's not just something published far away, which I eventually get hold of in Shropshire or Newcastle or whatever. But it could be something that's mine, it's ours. And it, because you can see your name in print or your friends, it's something that sort of binds people together. And I feel as well, one of the things it did, rather like the sort of social media world and so on, was it enabled people through these contributions, to have much more awareness that there were other people similar to them elsewhere in the country, even if they would never meet. So it's like a virtual club or society. So help people become more aware that being this sort of middling sort of person there were thousands of people like you who when the magazine came out at the beginning of the month, were also receiving the magazine, reading it, were interested in the same things. So I think it both gave opportunities to the middle class, but it also helped beginning to give them a sense of class consciousness, if you don't want to push it too far, sense of self, that they were part of a grouping.
I love that idea. Now, you did say men and women of letters.
I did. Yes. I don't like to leave women out ever from the historical thing. It's called the Gentleman's Magazine, so it implies it's for men, but it was certainly read by women and women corresponded to it. And it was billed as a family product in advertising, and we also know from letters or sent into it or from things people wrote in their sort of own diaries that children and quite young people sometimes read it and were readers there were people who read it from the age of sort of 9 or 10 and sort of grew up with it. So it was very much read in the household, and women did correspond with it. Some of them fairly well-known women, some of them a bit less well-known outside academic 18th century studies circles, and probably, we can't say how many, but a list of, one of the editors published a list of the leading correspondents, and about a quarter of them were women.
Wow.
So we shouldn't, I think, see it as for men, as a sort of men-only sort of thing. It certainly had no salacious content, and it was very decent and respectable, and it certainly was both read by and contributed to by women.
Wow. I hadn't really thought of it, but I think it's creating a name for a magazine that's got the hook, isn't it?
Yes.
It has got that aspirational aspects that you hinted at earlier.
Yes. I think some gentlemen, some landed gentlemen did read it, but I don't think that they were the key market. And obviously there aren't very many of them, so you've never been such a success if you're only selling it to sort of baronets and earls. It would never have had the market that it had.
No.
And you can see it in stately homes. If people who like listening to this podcast but I do this all the time now because it's the sort of geeky thing, but if I am visiting a stately home or something like the Brighton Pavilion, Sir John Soane's house, although he is arguably a middling sort, it's usually there on the shelves in the library. So people like that did read it and collect it and have it displayed and all nicely bound, but I don't think they were the core market for it.
No. Now, you've mentioned his name, Edward Cave, the founder of the Gentleman's Magazine. Now, why was he a pivotal figure in the history of the Gentleman's Magazine? What was it that made it an ultimate success with this huge numbers that we're talking?
As I mentioned earlier, I think it's his own personal background. He was from Northamptonshire, and he went to Rugby School, which was not a grand institution at the time. It was not prestigious in the way we might think of it now, and he in fact left early under something of a cloud. His father was a shoemaker, And he quite liked that sort of fairly humble background. He liked to call himself Ned Cave, the cobbler's son. That's almost to talk yourself down a little bit in order to show how great your rise is. So he had lots and lots of different careers. He'd worked for a timber merchant, he'd done this and that, not really settled down after leaving school. But he did eventually become apprenticed to a printer. So it was in the printing trade that he got to know really well. And he'd set up as a printer before the Gentleman's Magazine, and he had printed things which actually did have there were things aimed at, like translations of French things, which he would advertise as aimed at people who you might not know French, but you can have little access to this elevated language by buying my English translation for a busy person who's not had so much education. So I think he'd seen quite a lot of life. He'd lived not just in London where he'd ended up, but he had lived in Norwich, and he lived near Rugby. And I think he understood the sort of people he'd moved with and saw a gap in the market. I really think it was true entrepreneurialism to think up this very different sort of product and also to style it cleverly, both with the title, Gentleman's and Magazine. He created an editorial persona with a pseudonym, rather than calling himself as the editor or just being the editor. He called himself Sylvanus Urban. And I think it's a little bit pompous, but it captured what he's trying to do in that Sylvanus, imagine you might read it in the countryside, I think, Sylvan. Urban obviously is urban, so that's capturing two aspects of Britain at the time. And it also meant that it wasn't the periodical. He absolutely adored the Gentleman's Magazine. He was very proud of it. It wasn't too closely linked with him. And I think that's one of the things, this Sylvanus Urban persona allowed it to pass through different hands over those nearly 200 years without it having, that was the element of continuity, if you like, this editor. And that's how people addressed the magazine. If you sent a letter, you would say, "Dear Mr. Urban," and send it into not "Dear Editor" or "Dear Sir." So that also created this sense that it was a familial product, something that was your mate, really.
And what made him come to London, do we know?
It was the printing trade opportunities, and he'd also worked on Bankside for a timber merchant. So it's part of that general sort of moving around and also moving to London for work, which a lot of teenagers did at the time. And one of his successors, a man called David Henry, who became editor, had come to London age 14, all the way from Scotland by himself to be the printer's apprentice, and had ended up marrying into the Cave family and then taking over the editorship. People came to London a lot for work, both men and women. It was quite a normal life cycle thing. Some people passed through and went back home, and some stayed, as he did. So it's thought that 1 in 5 or so of the population of Britain had visited or lived in London at some time. So it was a big pull. It was way the biggest city. So London was, say, by the end of the century, about 1 million people. The next biggest place was under 100,000, roughly. So it's hugely bigger than anywhere else in the country.
Yeah.
And the nearest biggest place off, that's probably Dublin.
So you mentioned about him having the printing press, and it makes sense to keep the press pressing in order to get more out. And you also mentioned about the user-generated content of people writing in. But for the first few editions, how did he create that desire to be involved? Because did he have people writing in already? Had he done it?
Not really, no. I suppose no, not particularly. He was taking articles that had all been printed in other things, which was quite a standard sort of practice at the time. There wasn't much concept of that was some sort of theft of intellectual property. I think it was that he could made it interesting enough that people began to answer back to the articles, actually. So people began to reply to the articles or say, "I know this one," add a little bit more to it. And that built up a head of steam. And it then built up a head of steam, particularly with death notices. People started sending in notices of people they knew who had died, which sat alongside ones he was pinching from elsewhere. So you see over those 4 to 5 years a shift from the death notices being gentlemen of the old school, people with birth and estates and so on, and spreading out to being more geographically broadly based, and also to full range of some middling sort occupations being commemorated in the death list. So I think this gradually drew people in until he was able to shift over more entirely to that.
And what about the language used in the Gentleman's Magazine compared to the other periodicals? Was it more accessible, or is you don't want something to be too pompous to turn off an audience?
No, I think to us it would look a little bit pompous because the style of English is different, and because the editor, as a ringmaster, this sort of thing, he's obviously choosing which content to put in. So there's still an editorial selection, but there was definitely a shift towards making sure that the content was respectable, not crude or rude or rambunctious, which it was a little bit at first when initially people would sometimes write in with a slightly rude enigma to be solved, but that didn't last very long until it became this sort of sober and rather respectable publication. So the editor is choreographing that, but with this proviso that if people didn't, from letters that survive to Cave that survive and are in the British Library, people are very insistent if they don't see what the letter they've sent in print. So they feel no shame in saying, I sent you a letter, it's obviously got lost somewhere, but here's a copy of it. I'll expect to see it in the next issue. So people became quite demanding of seeing their stuff in print. Yeah, so I think it was a gradual drawing in process until that became the main thing, and excerpts from other things had more or less disappeared. But he carried on presenting the magazine, and this was the same with the other letters, in pretty much the same. It looked quite the same from the outside. So although the content had become more reader-led, the look of the magazine stayed remarkably similar over the time. So I think that's the great thing. If you're going to be a successful institution, you have to change without seeming to change. It's still recognisable, so it still has the image of St John's Gate on the front, even when the printing press has long moved elsewhere. It still is arranged that front half, back half, just the front half is readers' letters, not things from other periodicals, and the back half is more reader-led. So it still has that same shape and look, and it had very much the same look in terms of the typeface. And that's another interesting thing about it. It's quite ugly. If you pick it up and look at it, it's not nicely produced. It's quite cheap looking, and it will have a range of different typefaces. Sometimes it's laid across the whole page, sometimes it's in columns. And it's quite cramped, has quite tight margins, and it's all bunched together. So it's not a pretty looking thing. It's not prestigious in that way. Its main rival, the London magazine, which was started a year later to try and pinch some of the market from him, basically, and didn't last as long. It had collapsed by the 1770s, was a much more nice-looking product, had a bigger margin, it was better laid out, but it didn't last as long. And I think that slightly scrappy look of it was also part of its success. It's saying it's not about what you look like, it's about what's inside. It's content over form, and also by bunching the typeface up like this, having a really small font, you've got so much more value for money for your £6.
Yeah.
We've packed an awful lot in to these 48 pages. And I think that the thing that the current periodical that I think is similar to it but completely different in genre is Private Eye. If you look at Private Eye, it looks a bit like something that the sixth form in a boys' school have run off on a photocopier with lots of different types of layout, and it looks a bit amateur. And I think Cave wasn't an amateur, but by making it look like that, it looked more like something that belonged to you and was good value and was important for what was in it, not for its surface appearance.
Yeah, and that would resonate with his target audience.
Absolutely, yes. He did originally have a posher version for rich people, which cost a bit more, which was on bigger paper and so on, rather better paper. But that didn't seem to last very long. There are some in the library of George III, which is now, I think, at the British Museum. And I did get in touch with them and ask about this. They said, could you have a look at them and see what you think about the size? And they are this sort of more swanky version that you could have initially. But eventually it was just one product for everybody.
Okay. And Samuel Johnson is a name that is connected with the Gentleman's Magazine. And of course, he was a well-known figure in literature, and his father was a bookseller in Lichfield. How did he become associated with the Gentleman's Magazine?
I think he's from a background as a classic Gentleman's Magazine reader family, actually, with a bookseller father, quite well established in the provinces, but not obviously gentlemanly in the old-fashioned sense. So he was already a reader before he moved to London. which wouldn't surprise, I think, anyone at all, that he should be that sort of reader. So he knew the magazine. So one of the first things he did on moving to London to try to make his fortune, in that well-known story where he walks to London with David Garrick, one of the first things he did was write to Cave and say, if you're looking for someone to write bits and bobs for the Gentleman's Magazine, I'd be happy to do that. So he approached them as one of the things he was doing in order to try and establish himself as a literary figure in London. But very much before he was a name, he was doing these bits and pieces. And one of his first published pieces was in the Gentleman's Magazine, a poem about London. And he'd also actually, before he moved to London, one of the few adverts within the magazine was a little notice for a school Johnson had set up in Staffordshire, in Edial. I don't know if I've pronounced that correctly. He set up a school which was actually staggeringly unsuccessful. I think the Garricks were about the only pupils. And he did actually have a little thing placed in the Gentleman's Magazine advertising this school, advertising for pupils, basically. So it's something that was already within his sort of horizons that he sort of knew about, and which he therefore was an obvious thing to approach when he moved to London. And he subsequently took over writing the parliamentary reports in the Gentleman's Magazine and took them to a different sort of imaginative level, describing you couldn't report on Parliament at the time. You couldn't go in, take notes, and then print it up. This was against the law, and Cave had already got into trouble for that. But what Johnson did was he created this sort of fictitious thing, debates in the Senate of Lilliput, like the Gulliver's Travels, and gave every major figure in the House of Commons or House of Lords a kind of pseudonym. And so he covered it like that. And it may be he never even actually went or even took notes in the House of Commons, but he just invented it from what he'd heard. So that became a very sort of key part of the magazine for a period before he left to pursue other projects, notably obviously the dictionary. But he was very much part of a circle of people who moved in and out of the Gentleman's Magazine, doing bits and pieces of work, being friends with Cave. They had a small literary club that they'd meet in an inn. So he was part of a sort of social circle of people who remained many of whom remained part of Johnson's life. John's Gate was also, as well as a business place for producing printed works, it was also a little bit of a social hub where people gathered and met. Benjamin Franklin was somebody who went there while in London, where he too being a printer, and was part of that sort of circle.
Yeah, it makes sense because both Johnson and Franklin both lived in Little Britain for a little time, and that was known for its printing street. So yes, I suppose it all links together, doesn't it?
So you see, I think it helped Johnson move into sort of literary circles a bit and pick up bits of work, pick up contacts, as well as being a place where he was paid for some of the paid content in the magazine. But it's very much at the start of his career when he was really a nobody and pretty penniless, actually.
And how do you think Johnson's work in the magazine influenced his later work? Specifically, you mentioned about his famous English dictionary.
I think it probably mainly was things like the contacts or the methodology of putting it together that he may have picked up from being in the Gentleman's Magazine, assembling all the pieces of paper and getting them ready to print up and go on the day. That was obviously, because it was a working print shop, that was something he would have seen when he was there. Very much. St John's Gate was at times chaotic as well. And it'd be interesting to compare that to what it might have looked like in the attic at Gough Square, where Johnson was only really round the corner producing the dictionary with these bits of paper everywhere. I mean, it was apparently, when it came close to publication day of the magazine, the place was in total uproar with stuff everywhere. And I think it would also have taught him the need to be setting it up as you go along, because the Gentleman's Magazine comes out monthly, but some of it could be typeset and set up as you go along during the month. You haven't got to do the whole thing in sort of 2 days, although there's obviously a rush at the end to finalise it. So with the dictionary, it strikes me it's also something you can be setting up before you've got the whole way. It's not like taking your whole finished novel to be printed up by a printer. You're doing it bit by bit.
Yeah.
In the same way the Gentleman's Magazine, some pages would have been ready to go 2 weeks before publication day. Some, like the death notices, you've got to slot the last ones in at the end, which is why they're in date order, not an alphabetical order, because they're coming in until the last minute.
And can you share any insights that you have with the working relationship between Edward Cave and Samuel Johnson?
They were in a literary club together, so obviously they were friendly. Johnson wrote an obituary of Cave when Cave died, So I think he did feel close to him. This was the man who gave him his break. I don't think Cave was always easy to work for because it's pressurised getting a major magazine out. And I think entrepreneurial people like that often create pressure on others around them, because there was a journeyman printer worked for him with whom Cave had a spectacular falling out. I don't think it was always easy because of this chaotic last-minute thing, but I don't think Johnson was a super tidy person himself either, because he was personally slovenly, as we well know. But it does seem that they had a sort of close and affectionate relationship. Cave was slightly the older man, but not old enough to be entirely a father figure. But he was slightly older, and say he'd given this young Turk his early opportunities. And when you read the affectionate obituary, I think you can see that it's the gratitude for that.
Now, we've mentioned St John's Gate a few times now, so it might be worth explaining the significance in the history of the Gentleman's Magazine.
St John's Gate is an unusual survival in Clerkenwell, so fairly centrally in London, of a late medieval gateway to a religious establishment, which in the Reformation was obviously closed down, but the gateway survived. It's still there now, and you can go and visit it. It has a free museum, which is currently effectively owned by the St John's Ambulance body, so it's mainly geared to that, but it does have a little gentleman's magazine display. So it's basically a relic of old London, which has had various kind of uses over time since the mid-16th century. It had been housed a printing press in the late 17th century. It had briefly been the home of William Hogarth's family when he was a boy. His father had taken a lease on it with this rather fabulous idea, as he thought, of opening a coffee house where people had to talk in Latin to each other. I think your listeners will not be surprised to know this was not a huge success or particularly popular. Richard Hogarth, the father, was a classicist and a schoolmaster, but obviously not everybody wants in their downtime to be having to do hick, hike, hock with their fellow coffee drinkers. So it had collapsed and he'd ended up in a debtor's prison. So it had quite this colourful history, and I would imagine it was, although I've never seen figures, I'd imagine it wasn't a particularly expensive place to rent when you're setting up on your own, because it's quite an old building. I think it was advantageous because it was central. It was quite near the centre of the printing trade around St Paul's and Fleet Street, and it was distinctive, and it was used, little woodcuts, some of them changed over the years, of the St John's Gate were always used on the title page of the Gentleman's Magazine and on the cover in which you bought it. When you bought it, it was in like a soft cover of blue paper, and that had the woodcut on. So did the title page inside. So because it was a distinctive medieval building, it made us a really quite a strong branding image without putting off people who weren't Londoners. It's not like putting St Paul's on the cover or something that makes you conscious you're provincial. Mm-hmm. But it gave the magazine, again, this sort of personal quality, and it became somewhere that people did sometimes go to in the 18th century. If they're visiting London, they would sometimes go and have a look at it, presumably because they'd seen it on their magazines over the years and thought, I'll have a look at it. So that obviously probably drew in people like Franklin. It drew in an American refugee who came here during the War of Independence because he was loyal to the British Crown. One of the first things he wrote in his diary was, I went to have a look at St John's Gate where they produced the Gentleman's Magazine. So it was quite a focal point, and it's remained the branding image even after the whole process had moved elsewhere in the later century. The reason being it was, by that point, a dilapidated building, wasn't fit for purpose. It was too difficult to work in, and it was moved. So the printing was moved away to more modern buildings, and eventually the printing was moved over towards Westminster because the then editor and owner was also producing Hansard in the area where you could report on the Parliament, so it's more convenient. But it always had retained that St John's Gate image.
Yeah, it's interesting what you're saying, really, because when I was first introduced to the Gentleman's Magazine when I was studying and to be a Clerkenwell and Islington guide, it really perplexed me why St John's Gate.
Yes.
Out of anything. Because, as you said, it's not, quite right, it's not London-centric in that gate. There are large gates, medieval gates, all over the country that would have looked very similar. Yes. And also, I think it's bringing something of the old with you as you're journeying into the new frontier.
Yes, that's an interesting thing, that it's bridging the old and the new. I hadn't thought. That's a very interesting thought. Yes. Also, Cave didn't have children, so he didn't have to fit into this. He lived in the gate, but he didn't have to fit in kids and so on. It was just him and his wife.
Yeah.
So it wasn't as though they had children running up and down the rickety stairs or not enough space. So I think it was satisfactory during his time because he didn't need so much personal room.
Yeah, it is quite a small space when you start moving around.
So you can imagine if there's paper, letters, printing presses. I think it was not probably an easy place to be.
No, absolutely. But I think the light must have been really quite remarkable, especially on that bit, so you could get full sun from east to west.
Yes.
In your opinion, what is the enduring legacy of the Gentleman's Magazine? What is it that really, other than the editor name, Mr. Urban, continuing through, what is it that people continue to purchase it throughout the generations?
I think it's partly a comforting habit. And people would say, when they wrote their letters, they would often say something about how they felt about the magazine when they were submitting something. People described it as a friend. It's my old friend. I meet this old friend every month. So I think it was part of the routine of the cycle of their monthly, weekly, whatever life. And to that extent, when I said to the similarities with the Reader's Digest, a passing similarity with the look of Private Eye. And I've often been asked, what is it like in our society? What is it? I've thought about this long and hard, and what I usually say at the moment, and maybe I'll think of something else, I think it's a bit like the Today programme. You know, a whole section of society, of British middle-class society, listen to the Today programme pretty much daily. It's a sort of habit while you have your breakfast. It's a magazine format with some lighter-hearted stuff. People do email in, but it also keeps you up to date with the news. And I think people feel a familiarity with that in the background. And that's perhaps the most similar rapport between the audience and the product with the Gentleman's Magazine. I'm open to thinking about other ways it resembled things, but I think that's the closest one I've come across. So it became part of people's just everyday life. They expected to see it, it was comforting, see what's in it. Sometimes you end up with a little bit of correspondence going on through its pages between you and other people who you haven't met. And someone commented about correspondence he'd had with somebody else. He said, I've got to know him through the pages of your magazine, because they'd both been writing about a particular debate. I think it might have been Sunday schools or something like that. Are Sunday schools good because they're keeping kids out of harm on Sunday and giving them a bit of education and some Christian teaching? Or are they bad because you're teaching the lower orders to read, and then they'll read anything? They might start reading Thomas Paine or something like that.
Oh, goodness.
The whole world turned upside down. So it's not a debate that looks very important to us, but it was at the time. So people got to feel that they had friends through it.
I think it's also worth considering that life not in a city would have been very slow.
Oh, yes.
And you would not have seen very many people other on Sunday when you were trudging to the church and sitting there for several hours. But the periodical, that gives you insight to a bigger world, feeling connected, but also gives you an opportunity then to talk with others about it.
Yes. I think particularly a little subset of readers who particularly, I feel, used it in that way was Anglican vicars, some of whom are posted miles away from anywhere. It's very lonely. They're the only educated person in the parish, more or less, with very limited company, and was quite popular within vicar circles. And there was one who lived down in the West Country who said it eventually gets here during the month and I always look forward to it. So yes, it gave people some people like that, a bit of a connection with the world they'd partly been in when they'd been at one of the two universities, but now they were a bit cut off. It kept them in the swing of things with people like themselves and people. I'm just amazed how far it did penetrate quite quickly in time terms, from when it was printed to when it was out in places like Devon or Northern Ireland. It was quite extraordinary.
And how did it pass from one editor to another?
Usually it was somebody who was already within the circle who were producing the magazine. So after Cave died in the mid-1750s, it passed to a nephew, David Henry, who was connected through marriage. So they were already there working on it, and they took it over. John Nichols, who became the editor in round about the 1770s, he bought a stake in it from one of the Cave family was working on it. He was also a printer and was from Islington, as you probably know, and a printer of all sorts of other material, but he then became the editor. But he was already an insider being involved in it. And then it passed in the 19th century, when it was a less significant publication with a lot more competition, effectively. It passed through his son and grandson, and then it was bought out by various printing firms, passed, and then the publishing firms like Pickering and Chatto owned it at one point. But in the 18th century, it was passed internally by either sale to somebody who was already actively involved in producing the magazine, and it remained in the hands of people who were primarily running a print shop. They weren't, although they liked seeing themselves in print, they weren't people who started off as literary figures. And I think that's a change that the magazine marked as compared to sort of journals and periodicals in the late 17th and early 18th century, much more self-consciously literary, and the literary baby of the person producing it. This was a very commercial proposition.
Yeah, so looking looking at with business eyes rather than...
Yes. Which seems a little bit... In terms of the financing of magazine, there are some surviving papers from the rival, the London magazine, which gives some idea what it cost per sheet of paper. And I've looked at that, but it wasn't really the focus of what I was doing, I think, to consider it, how much of the sixpence they kept.
Oh, it's all intriguing, isn't it? And how do people get to know about the Gentleman's Magazine a little bit more, Gillian?
I could read my slightly heavyweight book on it. You can actually read them quite easily online. If you put it into a search term into Google Books, you can read. They've been digitised. You look at some there. You can. It's been digitised on some sort of collected databases, and I think one of the best ways is just to have a little play around and look at it, or think of. You can put in a subject into Google Books, like some subject matter you think might come up in the 18th century, and Gentleman's Magazine, and you'll probably get a hit and see the sort of thing that was in it. So I say the best way is to try and find a copy, probably digitally, and have a little play around with it and see what it's like. And I think particularly looking at the obituaries is great fun. I know it sounds a bit morbid, but they become really fascinating by the 1770s, when readers' families are submitting obituaries which become mini biographies of people who are not, in the grand scheme of history, distinguished, and therefore quite interesting for family historians. I once met, when I went to a talk at Samuel Johnson's house in Gough Square, I met someone who was a descendant of one of the obituaries, actually, and who, his sort of great sort of uncle or something had one of the obituaries that I use, I think, because it puffs a rags to riches story of someone who's become very grand, gentlemanly, and a director of the East India Company, but has started off as a sort of quite humble person from the north who had to come to London with 2 shillings in a knapsack. So we were able to quote the obituary to each other, which was really... So it's an interesting resource, I think, for local and family history. People might find it's quite, if they have a particular village or parish they're interested in, there might be an article and someone may have sent in a little illustration which has been printed.
So these are generally people that don't get to go in the history books.
No, that's right. I think that's one of the pleasures of it. They extended going in the history books to lots of people who are recorded for posterity in the Gentleman's Magazine. But I say one of the best ways to say it is to look at it. And perhaps go and have... There's a very small display in St John's Gate, a small display about the Gentleman's Magazine. And you can look out for it in... You can buy it second-hand. You can buy it on eBay. And you can buy things that, rather sadly, the pictures have often been cut out and are being sold separately by dealers. So you can acquire... But they'll usually say Gent Mag somewhere on the bottom of the print. So you can buy... I bought a copy, as a sort of handling copy if I'm giving talks. I think it's nice for people to see what you can buy copies reasonably cheaply on eBay. So that's another sort of way of accessing it or thinking about it.
So, Gillian, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.